Hi, it's Mr. Pinkerton, and in this video I'm going to be talking about cell growth and division. Before we get started, I thought I'd just show you this little video I found, and this will help give you an idea of what we're going to be talking about.
New cells are formed by cell division, in which one cell splits to become two cells. Cell division involves two processes. In the first, called nuclear division, the nucleus divides. In the second process, cytokinesis, the cytoplasm divides, producing two cells.
So in order to talk about cell growth and division, there's a few other things that we need to cover. One, we'll have to talk about cell theory, which we might have talked about before. We'll get to that right next. We'll also need to talk a little bit about limits to growth. Cells can only grow so big. It cannot become gigantic. You don't see gigantic cells walking around. We'll also talk about the cell cycle, and we'll talk about chromosomes and what chromosomes are and how they play a role here in cell division. Really, they are what cell division is all about. We'll talk about mitosis, and we'll also talk about the regulation of the cell cycle, how the cell cycle is regulated. So some of this might be review, I'm not sure, but let's take a look here at the cell theory. But one thing we do know for certain is that all living things are made of cells. All living things are made of cells. I think that is obvious. We also have talked about that cells are the basic unit of life, so they're the basic unit of living things. And new cells can only be produced from living cells. So the only way to get a cell is from another cell. So cells divide, and they keep dividing, and they keep dividing. And if you think about it, you started out, here's a little egg cell and a little sperm cell. You started out as one zygote, one cell, and now there are trillions of cells in your body. So all living things are made of cells, and cells can only come from other cells. So what is it about cells that causes them to have to divide? How come you can't start with just a small cell and have it grow and get bigger and get bigger and get bigger? How come they have to stop growing, and why is it that they have to divide? How come instead of getting this situation where we just get bigger and bigger and bigger, we have this situation where we're dividing and dividing and dividing? Well, the answer has to do with the limit to growth, and because the larger a cell becomes, the more demands are placed on its DNA. The DNA can only handle so much work, and also cells have trouble moving nutrients in and out if they get to be too big. It's almost like you can't grow to be from the size you are now to a giant version of yourself and still expect to be able to live in your house and get enough food. So it's the same way, cells have to divide at a certain point because they can't get enough, they can't get enough to eat if they got to be too big. So before it becomes too big, a growing cell, it's going to grow a little bit, maybe it grows to be like this size, but before it gets to be too big, it's going to divide, and it's going to divide into two what we call daughter cells. And this process of dividing into two daughter cells is what we call cell division. Now in eukaryotes, remember what eukaryotes are, cell division has two major stages, The first stage is when the nucleus divides, and we call that process mitosis. Okay, so mitosis is really the division of the nucleus. It's not division of the cell itself. It's the formation of two nuclei. So you might get a situation like this. Here's a cell with a nucleus, and then after the process of mitosis, there's a cell that still has two nuclei. So here's your mitosis, right here. And then the process of cell dividing the cytoplasm is called cytokinesis, and here is when you'd actually get two cells that have gone through cytokinesis. Now we're going to have to pause for a minute and talk briefly about chromosomes. So you might know what a chromosome is. We've talked about it before, but we know that it contains all the genetic information. So if it contains genetic information, then it must contain DNA. So chromosomes contain DNA, the genetic information. And before a cell divides, it has to copy the DNA. So the DNA has to be copied. And let's just depict the DNA as a little squiggle of lines here. There's our DNA. And each cell also has the same DNA. So all cells have the same DNA. Each cell has the same DNA as every other cell. And in order for that to happen, it must be copied. So in a cell, DNA takes the form of a chromosome, and sometimes you might see something that kind of looks like this. This is a chromosome, and that it's really a bad drawing, but that's a depiction of a chromosome that contains the DNA. So here's our familiar picture of a cell, and I've just shown the chromosome. This is not very well written here, but the DNA is in here. Oops. The DNA is in here. There's your DNA. And it takes the form of chromosomes when the cell is beginning to divide. Now, let's get back to cell division. Cell division occurs through something called the cell cycle. So a cycle is something that has a beginning and an end and then starts over again. So a cycle kind of looks like this. There might be a life cycle. There might be a water cycle. Can you think of other sorts of cycles that you've heard about in science? But a cycle is something that has a beginning and an end and then starts over again. So cells do this. They have a cycle, and they go through this as they grow and divide. And the first part of the cycle is something we call interphase. And interphase isn't really a period of time when the cell is dividing. It's a period of time when the cell is growing, and it occurs between cell divisions. So when a cell is just kind of hanging out here doing its cell thing, it's in interphase. Okay, that's interphase. And it's just sitting here. It's doing whatever its job is. Every cell has a job, and that job takes place during interphase. And then, after a period of time, when it gets to be big enough, the cell will actually grow and divide. So during this whole cell cycle, what does a cell do? Well, it grows. So it might be small, and then it might get a little bit bigger. But then it prepares for division. And then once it prepares for division, it divides into the two daughter cells, and then they do that again. There's a period of interphase, and they might get to be a little bit bigger, and then they're going to divide, and they just keep doing this. Now I'll give you a chance to look at a diagram in a minute, but the cell cycle really consists of four phases. Consists of four phases. The first one is called G1. It's the first gap phase. Then there's then there's the S phase, the G2, and then the M phase. And we'll learn about what each one of these means. But it's important to note that the G1, the S, and the G2 are all interphase, and the rest of it is, the M phase is part of the cell division phase. Now, what happens during G1? In G1, the cell gets bigger. It increases in size. So it's probably going to go... this is going to increase in size a little bit, and it's going to perform whatever cell function it has. And it's making new proteins and new organelles as it goes along. Now, the S phase is extremely important because this is when the chromosomes are replicated. That means copied. The chromosomes are copied during S phase, and this is when DNA synthesis takes place. So you'll have chromosomes being copied. So again, we have our cell, and we have our nucleus here, and the DNA is in there. It's going to be copied during the S phase. Now, during G2, second gap, this is when all the organelles, we're getting ready for mitosis now. We're getting ready for cell division, and all the organelles and molecules are being copied at this time. And when it's done, the cell is ready to start, and this is when we start mitosis. And mitosis is, again, the division of the nucleus, and then the division of the cytoplasm. And we'll talk about that next time. But before we do that, we should take a look here at this diagram. Again, this is our cell cycle. You will probably get used to seeing this. Here's our G1 phase, growth. This is our S phase. So I'm going to call this The growth phase. Oops, missed a W there. Growth phase. S phase, we call it our synthesis. So the synthesis means to make. This is when the DNA is copied. And then we have our G2. We're getting ready here. G2, getting ready. And here is the M phase here. And this is mitosis, which we will get into at the next lesson.